Did you know that most medieval people never read a story? They heard it. A storyteller, a priest, or a traveling minstrel would perform it. This changed everything. Stories were not quiet, private things. They were public events. They were loud. They were shaped for the ear, not the eye. They had to be memorable. They had to hold the attention of a restless crowd in a noisy hall. Because of this, medieval storytellers developed a whole set of tools we've mostly forgotten. We think of stories as a straight line. They thought of them as a woven tapestry, or a circle, or a set of nesting boxes. We want psychological realism. They wanted moral clarity. We want originality. They valued tradition. What if their way of telling stories wasn't primitive but just different? What if these forgotten techniques could show us something new about how we tell our own stories today? Number 20. What if a story was woven, not written? Stories today usually follow one person, or maybe two. We get a clear beginning, middle, and end for their journey. Medieval stories were different. They were often woven like a tapestry. They didn't follow one thread. They followed many, and they dropped and picked up those threads whenever they wanted. The technique is called interlace or entrelacement in French. Imagine you're following a knight on a quest. He rides into a forest. Suddenly the story just drops him. It picks up with another knight in a completely different part of the kingdom. Then it switches to a queen held captive in a castle. Then it moves to a third knight fighting a dragon. You might not hear about that first knight again for 50 pages. When you finally return to him, he's in the middle of a new adventure and the story just picks up as if no time has passed. This feels strange to us. It can feel messy or confusing. We want to know what happened next. But for the medieval audience, this was normal. The most famous example is Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, written around 1470. It's a massive book that follows dozens of knights from the Round Table. You follow Lancelot, then Gawain, then Tristan, then Galahad. Their stories overlap and intersect. A scholar named Eugene Vinever was one of the first to really study this in the 20th century. He argued that you can't understand Malory's book if you read it looking for a modern novel. It's not one story, it's a collection of stories braided together. This wasn't just messy writing. It had a purpose. First, it built suspense. What happened to that knight in the forest? Is he still alive? You had to keep listening or reading to find out. Second, it showed a world where everyone's actions were connected, even if the characters didn't know it. A decision made by Lancelot in one chapter could have a ripple effect that touches Sir Bors 50 pages later. It mirrored the way they saw the world, a complex pattern created by God, where everything was part of a larger divine design. You couldn't just see one thread, you had to see the whole tapestry to understand. This worldview, a concept often called the Great Chain of Being, suggested an ordered, interconnected universe where every person and event had its place. The interlaced story structure was a literary reflection of that belief. It also allowed for a huge cast of characters and a sprawling world, which was perfect for the epic romances of the time. Some scholars, like C.S. Lewis in his work The Discarded Image, suggest this structure also came from the physical act of creating manuscripts. A scribe might be copying from several different source texts or exemplars. He might work on one story for a while, then switch to another source for a different part of the larger narrative. The physical process of compilation could have influenced the creative one. The story was literally being assembled from pieces, just like a tapestry. Did a reader in 1485 find this structure more natural than we do? Were their brains wired to handle these narrative jumps because their world felt less linear? What if the interlace technique is actually a more realistic way to show the chaos of life than a simple A to B to C plot? Could a blockbuster movie ever be structured this way? Or has our collective attention span shrunk too much to follow the threads? And number 19, could a character just be an idea walking around? When we read a modern novel, we expect characters to be complex. They have backstories, psychological motivations, and internal conflicts. They feel like real people. Medieval characters often don't. A knight might be described simply as brave. A lady is fair. A villain is evil. And that's it. We're tempted to call this bad writing. But it wasn't. They were doing something different. They were using a technique called didactic allegory. In an allegory, characters and events are not just what they are symbols for something else. The character isn't a person, they are a walking, talking idea. The story isn't just a story, it's a lesson. The most famous example of this is the 15th century play Everyman. The main character is named Everyman. He represents all of humanity. When death comes for him, every man looks for friends to go with him. He asks fellowship, kindred, and goods. They all refuse. Fellowship says he'll hang out and have a drink, but he won't face death. Goods says he can't go because earthly wealth can't be taken to the grave. The only character who will go with every man is good deeds. The characters are not subtle. Their names tell you exactly what they represent. The point of the story is not to explore the complex psychology of a man named Everyman. The point is to teach a very direct moral and religious lesson at the end of your life. Only your good deeds will matter. The audience wasn't supposed to wonder about Fellowship's childhood trauma or Good's economic philosophy. They were supposed to see themselves in Everyman and understand the message. This technique was everywhere in the Middle Ages. In the long poem Piers Plowman, written by William Langland in the late 14th century, the main character, Will, goes on a spiritual journey where he meets characters like Dow'll do well, Dubbit do better, and Dobus do best. These aren't people, they're stages of spiritual perfection. Another huge influence was a 5th century Latin poem called the Psychomachia by Prudentius. It describes a literal battle between virtues and vices. Hope fights despair. Chastity fights lust. The characters are personified abstractions. This text was incredibly popular and was copied and illustrated for 1,000 years, deeply embedding the allegorical mode into the medieval mind. The audience was trained to look for the second deeper meaning in everything. A forest wasn't just a forest, it was a place of spiritual testing. A castle wasn't just a castle, it could be the soul under siege by sin. For them, this was a higher form of reality. The physical world was temporary and flawed. The world of ideas, of virtues and vices, of sin and salvation was eternal and more real. An allegorical story wasn't a simplification of reality. It was an illustration of a deeper truth. It's a way of thinking we've largely lost. We tend to see symbolism as something added on top of a realistic story. For them, the symbolism was the entire point. What if our obsession with psychological realism is just a trend, and in 500 years it will look as strange as allegory does to us? Could a modern story with characters named ambition and integrity ever be taken seriously? Have we lost the ability to see the world in symbolic terms, or have we just traded religious allegory for political or psychological allegories? Is a character like the Joker in modern films really a person, or is he just a walking, talking symbol for chaos? Number 18. What if the story had to prove it was true? Today, we accept fiction as fiction. When we open a novel, we don't need the author to prove that the story really happened. We have a contract with the author, we agree to suspend our disbelief. In the Middle Ages, that contract was different. There was a deep suspicion of things that were just made up. Fiction, especially prose fiction, was seen as potentially deceptive, a form of lying. To get around this, writers used a clever trick, the found manuscript conceit. The storyteller would begin by claiming they were not the author of the story. They were merely a translator, an editor, or the lucky person who discovered an old, forgotten document. The story they are about to tell is a true history, found in a dusty chest, a remote monastery, or given to them by a mysterious stranger. This gave the story a layer of authenticity. It wasn't a flight of fancy, it was a historical record being brought to light. One of the most influential examples is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, from around 1136. This book introduced the world to King Arthur, as we know him, along with Merlin, Guinevere, and Excalibur. It was a sensation, but Geoffrey didn't present it as his own invention. He claimed in his preface that he was simply translating a certain very ancient book in the British tongue, given to him by Walter, the Archdeacon of Oxford. This ancient book has never been found. Most scholars are certain it never existed. Geoffrey likely made it up to give his incredible stories the weight of historical authority. And it worked. For centuries, his history was accepted as fact by many people. This technique became a standard feature of medieval romance. The great French poet Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the late 12th century, used it for his Arthurian tales. In the prologue to his romance Clyde, he says he found the story written down in a book in the library of the Cathedral of Saint Pierre at Beauvais. By doing this, he's telling his audience, don't blame me for any of the wild stuff that happens. I'm just telling you what the old book said. It was a way to have his cake and eat it too. He could tell fantastical stories full of giants, magic, and dragons, while still maintaining a pose of being a serious, truthful historian. This practice tells us something profound about the medieval relationship with truth and authority. When authority came from the past, an old book was considered more trustworthy than a new one. The word auctor, author, was closely linked to auctoritas, authority. By claiming to be a mere translator of an ancient source, a writer was borrowing the authority of antiquity for their own work. It was a world that valued transmission over invention. The best storyteller wasn't the one who made up the most original plot, but the one who could best retell and embellish the great stories of the past. Did medieval audiences actually believe these claims about found manuscripts, or was it a game everyone was in on, a literary convention they all understood? If an author today claimed their fantasy novel was a translation of a real ancient text, would they be celebrated or sued for fraud? How is the found manuscript conceit different from the modern, based on a true story tag we see on movies, which is often just as fictional? Number 17, do you need a map to understand the past? When we think about history, we think in a straight line. The Roman Empire came first, then the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance, and so on. We call this linear time. The medieval way of thinking was different. They saw time as both linear and cyclical. But more importantly, they saw a direct symbolic connection between events separated by hundreds or even thousands of years. This technique is called typology. Typology started as a way of reading the Bible. Early Christian theologians, like Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, developed a system where people and events in the Old Testament were seen as types, or prefigurations of people and events in the New Testament. For example, Jonah spending 3 days in the belly of the whale was a type for Christ spending 3 days in the tomb before the resurrection. Adam was a type for Christ, the new Adam. The sacrifice of Isaac was a type for the crucifixion. The Old Testament wasn't just a collection of old stories, it was a shadow or a prophecy of the story of Jesus. This way of thinking didn't stay in theology. It spilled out and shaped all forms of storytelling. A medieval person listening to a story about a hero was trained to look for these typological connections. A good king in a romance, like King Arthur, wasn't just a good king. He could be seen as a type for Christ, a ruler who brings justice in order to a fallen world. His betrayal by Mordred could echo the betrayal of Christ by Judas. The stories were happening on two levels at once, the literal level of knights and castles, and the symbolic, typological level of salvation history. You can see this at work in the Old English poem, The Dream of the Rood, written down in the 10th century Vercelli book. In the poem, the cross itself speaks and tells the story of the crucifixion. But it describes Christ as a young, strong warrior, eagerly climbing onto the cross as if mounting a horse for battle. This wasn't because the poet didn't know the story, it was because he was blending the biblical narrative with the values of his own Anglo-Saxon warrior culture. And Christ is presented as an epic hero, and the crucifixion is his heroic battle. So this is a form of typology connecting the events of the gospel to the cultural archetypes of the audience. This way of thinking created a world that was rich with meaning. Everything was connected. History wasn't a random series of events, it was a divinely written story, and every part of it rhymed with every other part. When they looked at their own time, they saw patterns from the past repeating themselves. A crusade wasn't just a military campaign, it was a new exodus, with the Crusaders as the new Israelites marching to a new promised land. This understanding of time and history is fundamentally different from our own. We look for cause and effect. They looked for pattern and correspondence. Is it possible that our brains are no longer capable of seeing the world typologically? Has our scientific cause and effect worldview erased this kind of symbolic thinking? What if all stories are just retellings of older stories and typology was just a more honest way of admitting it? Are there modern types in our storytelling, like the rebellious hero being a type for a revolutionary figure or a wise mentor being a type for a secular prophet? Number 16. What if the story started with a list of names? Imagine picking up a new fantasy novel, and the first 10 pages are just a list of who was whose great-grandfather. You'd probably put it down, it sounds incredibly boring, but for a medieval audience, this was not boring at all. It was essential. Many medieval epics and romances begin with a genealogical prologue. The storyteller would spend a great deal of time tracing the lineage of the main character. This hero didn't just appear out of nowhere. He was the son of a famous warrior who was the son of a king who was descended from a legendary founder of the nation who might even be descended from a figure from classical mythology like Aeneas of Troy. The Old English epic Beowulf, first written down around the year 1000, begins not with Beowulf, but with the story of Sildsifing, the legendary founder of the Danish royal line. We hear about his mysterious arrival, his successful reign, and his spectacular funeral. Only then do we get to his descendants, and eventually to King Hrothgar, the one who needs Beowulf's help. Why did they do this? For several reasons. First, in a society structured around kinship, family and lineage were everything. Your identity was not just who you were, but who you came from. Your ancestors' reputation was your reputation. By establishing a hero's noble lineage, the storyteller was immediately establishing his credentials. He was worthy of our attention because he came from a line of worthy people. This resonated deeply in the feudal societies of the Middle Ages, where inheritance and bloodlines determined one's place in the world. Second, it connected the current story to the great stories of the past. By linking a local English or French hero back to the heroes of Troy or Rome, the storyteller was claiming a place for their culture within the grand sweep of history. The Matter of Britain, the stories of Arthur, and the Matter of France, the stories of Charlemagne, were often given Trojan origins. This was a form of cultural legitimization. It said, "We are not barbarians. We are the inheritors of the great classical tradition." Geoffrey of Monmouth, for example, claimed that Britain was founded by Brutus, the great-grandson of the Trojan hero Aeneas. This directly linked the history of Britain to the epic story of the Aeneid. Finally, these genealogies served as a kind of map for the audience. They laid out the political and social landscape of the story. They explained the relationships between different tribes and families, which often became crucial to understanding the conflicts and alliances in the plot. In an oral culture where you couldn't just flip back to a character list, these opening passages helped to fix the key players in the listener's memory. The Bible does this too, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, which famously begins with the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The purpose is the same: to establish authority and place the central figure within a meaningful historical and theological context. Has the modern emphasis on individualism made us lose this sense of connection to our ancestors? What vital information are we missing when we skip the begats in the Bible or the long family histories in epic poems? Could a modern story ever successfully begin with a genealogy, or have we completely lost the patience for it? Is our modern obsession with world building in fantasy just a different, more elaborate way of doing the same thing as a genealogical prologue? Number 15, was dreaming the only way to tell the truth? Many medieval stories don't start with "once upon a time," they start with the narrator falling asleep. The main action of the story then takes place within a dream. This is the dream vision framework, and it was one of the most popular literary genres of the Middle Ages. The setup is often very similar. The narrator, usually a version of the poet himself, is troubled by some question or sorrow. He wanders out into a beautiful landscape, often in the month of May. He sits down by a river or under a tree, and he falls asleep. In his dream, he is guided through a strange, symbolic landscape by an authority figure, a wise man, an angel, a beautiful woman, or even a talking animal. This guide explains the meaning of what he sees, answering the question that was troubling him when he was awake. At the climax of the dream, the narrator often tries to grasp something or ask one final question, and this act of reaching causes him to wake up. He is left with the memory of the dream and the lesson it taught him. Why was this so popular? The dream frame solved a number of problems for the medieval writer. First, it solved the problem of authority we saw with the found manuscript conceit. How can a humble writer presume to speak about profound topics like divine love, salvation, or political corruption? In a dream vision, the writer isn't the one speaking with authority. He is just a confused dreamer, and the truth is revealed to him by a higher power. This gave the author a cloak of humility while allowing them to tackle the biggest questions. Second, the dream world allowed for a kind of imaginative freedom that was difficult in a realistic story. In a dream, animals can talk, buildings can be made of abstract concepts, and the laws of physics don't apply. This made it the perfect vehicle for allegory. The 14th century poem Pearl is a perfect example. A father, mourning the death of his young daughter, falls asleep on her grave. In his dream, he is in a beautiful garden and sees his daughter across a river. She is now a queen in heaven, and she explains the nature of God's grace to him. The landscape and the conversation are deeply symbolic. He can't cross the river to join her, that is death itself. He wakes up as he tries to plunge into the water. Other famous dream visions include the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, though it's more of a vision than a dream, where Dante is guided through hell, purgatory, and heaven. William Langland's Piers Plowman is a series of complex dream visions about the social and spiritual state of England. Even Geoffrey Chaucer, often seen as a more realistic writer, used the dream vision framework for poems like The Book of the Duchess and The Parliament of Fowls. He plays with the convention, sometimes making his narrator a bit clumsy and bookish, but he still uses the structure to explore themes of love and loss. The dream was a legitimate portal to another, more meaningful reality. Did medieval people believe their actual dreams were sources of divine revelation, making this genre feel less like a literary device and more like a documentary? If a modern poet wrote a serious dream vision, would it be dismissed as self-indulgent or surrealist art? Have we outsourced our dream analysis from priests and poets to psychologists and therapists? Is the whole genre of science fiction, with its alternate worlds and guiding aliens, just a secular version of the medieval dream vision? Number 14. How do you tell a story when everyone already knows the ending? Imagine a Hollywood studio making a movie where the trailer shows the final scene. It seems like a terrible idea. We value suspense and surprise. For much of medieval storytelling, this was not a concern. The audiences for epics like Beowulf or the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, were not coming to the story for the first time. They already knew the plot. They knew the hero would die. They knew who would win the battle. So if suspense wasn't the point, what was? The storyteller's skill was not in inventing a new plot, but in the telling of the old one. This is where oral formulaic composition comes in. This technique was first studied in depth by two scholars, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, in the 20th century. They studied modern-day epic singers in Yugoslavia to understand how ancient Greek poets like Homer could have composed massive poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey without writing them down. They discovered that these poets weren't memorizing the entire epic word for word. Instead, they had a huge mental toolkit of pre-made phrases, or formulas, that fit the meter of the poem. This same technique was at the heart of much of Old English, Old Norse, and Old French epic poetry. A poet telling the story of Beowulf had a stock of formulas for common ideas. The king was a ring giver, Bigabrita. The sea was the whale-road Hranraid. A battle was a storm of swords. These weren't cliches in the way we think of them. They were the building blocks of the poem. Using these formulas, the poet could improvise a performance of the story, making it slightly different each time, but always following the traditional plot. The audience wasn't waiting to see what would happen, but how the poet would describe it this time. They would appreciate a particularly clever use of a formula, a powerful description of a well-known scene, or the emotional intensity the performer brought to a famous speech. This is a fundamentally different kind of artistry than what we expect from a writer today. We prize originality above all. We want a writer to invent new worlds, new characters, new plots, and new language. A medieval oral poet was prized for their mastery of tradition. Their genius was in their ability to use the established, shared language of the culture to make the old story feel immediate and powerful right now, in this hall, for this audience. The physical setting was crucial. These poems were performed, often with musical accompaniment from a harp or lyre, in a communal hall filled with warriors. The performance was a community event. The stories reinforced the values of the group: courage, loyalty, generosity. When the poet sang of Beowulf's bravery, he was reminding the warriors in the hall of their own code of conduct. The repetition of formulas also helped the audience. In a noisy, live setting, a certain amount of repetition made the story easier to follow. It was a shared experience, and the familiar phrases were like a chorus everyone knew. If we were to revive oral formulaic storytelling, what would our modern formulas be? He picked up his smartphone, the glowing rectangle of fate, the traffic jam, a river of steel and sorrow. Have we completely lost the capacity to enjoy a story if we know the ending? Or do we just satisfy it by rewatching our favorite movies over and over? Is the highly formulaic structure of a pop song or a superhero movie a distant echo of this ancient technique? Number 13. What if the hero's main job was to die? Modern stories are often about self-discovery. The hero goes on a journey, overcomes obstacles, and becomes a better, more complete version of themselves. Medieval stories had a very different kind of hero, especially in the genre of hagiography or the lives of saints. In these stories, the hero's main purpose was not to change or grow, but to demonstrate their unwavering faith, often by suffering and dying in a spectacular way. Hagiography was possibly the most popular genre of literature in the Middle Ages. The most famous collection was the Golden Legend Legenda Aurea, compiled by Jacobus de Voragine in Italy around 1260. It was a medieval bestseller with more surviving manuscript copies than almost any other book, including the Bible. It contained the life stories of all the major saints, organized by their feast days in the church calendar. And these stories followed a very clear formula. The formulaic tropes of hagiography were instantly recognizable to a medieval audience. The saint's life usually began with a noble or miraculous birth. As a child, they showed extraordinary piety, rejecting games to spend time in prayer. As an adult, they performed miracles healing the sick, raising the dead, or commanding wild animals. And then came the central part of the story for a martyr of the Passion. The saint would be arrested by a pagan Roman authority figure. They would give a long, defiant speech defending their faith. Then the tortures would begin. And the tortures were described in graphic, almost loving detail. The saint would be stretched on the rack, burned with torches, have their skin flayed, or their teeth pulled out. But through it all, they would remain steadfast, often aided by divine intervention. An angel might appear to comfort them, or the instruments of torture would miraculously break. Finally, the frustrated tyrant would order the saint to be beheaded, as this was seen as a noble death. After their death, more miracles would occur at their tomb, proving their sainthood. To a modern reader, this can seem repetitive and gruesome. The characters are completely flat. The saint is perfectly good, and the pagan villain is perfectly evil. There is no psychological depth. But that wasn't the point. The story was not meant to be a realistic biography. It was a tool for inspiration and instruction. The saint was a model Christian. Their suffering mirrored the suffering of Christ. Their ultimate triumph over death offered hope to the audience. The graphic descriptions of torture were not just for shock value. They were meant to emphasize the incredible strength of the saint's faith. If St. Lawrence could endure being roasted alive on a gridiron and, according to legend, joked to his torturers, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side," then a common person could surely endure their own smaller, everyday trials. These stories were also a vital part of the cult of saints, which was central to medieval religious life. People would pray to specific saints for help with specific problems. Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth pulled out during her martyrdom, became the patron saint of toothache. The stories authenticated the power of the saints' relics and encouraged pilgrimages to their shrines. They were functional stories, designed to do a job in the real world. Is there a modern equivalent to hagiography? Are the biographies of inspirational figures like Steve Jobs or Martin Luther King Jr., which often simplify their lives into a clear narrative of struggle and triumph, a form of secular sainthood? Why are we so fascinated by stories of extreme suffering and endurance, from true crime podcasts to survival movies? Did the focus on martyrdom create a culture that glorified suffering in a way that we would now find deeply unhealthy? And number 12, why would a storyteller keep interrupting the story? When you're listening to a story, you want to get lost in it. The last thing you want is for the narrator to keep breaking the mood to talk directly to you. But medieval storytellers did this all the time. It's a technique called the direct address to the audience, or sometimes by its German name, Aufforderung zur Aufmerksamkeit, a call for attention. An oral performer in a drafty, noisy medieval hall couldn't take the audience's attention for granted. People were eating, drinking, talking, dogs were barking. The storyteller had to be a showman. They had to constantly manage the crowd, so they would pepper their performance with direct commands and comments. They would shout, "Listener, harker, now pay attention to this part." This was a practical tool to get everyone to quiet down and focus on a crucial plot point. But it was more than just classroom management. This technique created a direct personal relationship between the storyteller and the audience. It broke the fourth wall that we now hold so sacred. The storyteller wasn't an invisible, objective voice. He was a person in the room with you, sharing a story. He could express his own opinions about the characters. For example, in the middle of a battle scene, in a chanson de geste, a French song of deeds, the poet might say, "Oh, what a noble knight was Roland. You have never heard of a braver man," and the villain Ganelon, may God curse him, came up with a treacherous plan. But this told the audience exactly what to think. There was no moral ambiguity. The storyteller was your guide, making sure you understood who the good guys and bad guys were. The great English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, writing at the end of the 14th century, mastered this technique and turned it into a sophisticated literary device in the Canterbury Tales. The whole book is a collection of stories told by a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. But Chaucer, the author, creates a narrator, a slightly naive and bumbling version of himself, who is one of the pilgrims. This narrator, Chaucer the Pilgrim, constantly addresses the reader directly. He apologizes for the rude language in the Miller's Tale, saying, "Don't blame me, I'm just reporting what he said." He asks the reader to forgive his own shortcomings as a writer. This creates a complex, ironic distance between the author, the narrator, and the stories themselves. It makes the act of storytelling itself a central theme of the work. This technique also shows up at the beginning and end of stories. A storyteller might begin by saying, "If you will all be quiet and listen, I will tell you a tale of great adventure." And they often ended with a formulaic closing that brought the audience back to the present moment. A typical ending might be, "Here ends the tale of Sir Lancelot. May God grant us all a good end. And please say a prayer for the one who told this story." This performative ending, or envoy, reminded everyone that the story was a human creation, a performance that had now concluded, and it often served to ask for a reward, whether spiritual prayers or material, a drink or a coin. Could a modern novelist get away with writing? And now, dear reader, pay attention, because this next part is really important. Why do we not prefer our narrators to be invisible and our fiction to feel like an unmediated window onto another world? Are the recaps at the beginning of TV show episodes previously on a modern, impersonal version of the old storytellers? Let me remind you what happened last time. Number 11. Could the footnotes be more important than the main text? When we read a book, we focus on the main block of text in the center of the page. We might glance at the footnotes or endnotes for a citation, but we see them as secondary, as something outside the real story. On a medieval manuscript page, this division was not so clear. The page was a conversation. The main text was in the center, but the margins were filled with other kinds of writing. This is the world of marginalia and glosses. A gloss was an explanation of a word or phrase in the main text. A scribe copying a Latin text might write the vernacular, e.g. Old English or Old French translation of a difficult word directly above it. This was an interlinear gloss. Or they might write a longer comment in the margin explaining a difficult concept, cross-referencing it to another text or adding their own thoughts. These marginal glosses could accumulate over time. A later scribe or reader might add their own comment next to the first one, creating a debate in the margins that spanned centuries. The book was not a static, finished object. It was an ongoing scholarly project. Marginalia could be more than just scholarly notes. Scribes were often monks, and their work was long, tedious, and painstaking. They would let their minds wander and their personalities show in the margins. They drew doodles, elaborate illustrations known as drolleries, and wrote personal comments. There are famous examples of scribes complaining in the margins. "The ink is bad, my hand is freezing," or, "Thank God, it will soon be dark." One Irish monk, working in the 9th century, wrote a beautiful short poem in the margin about his cat, Pangur Ban, who hunted mice while the monk hunted words. This gives us a startlingly human connection to these people from 1,000 years ago. Sometimes the marginalia could create a second, parallel narrative. The main text might be a serious, pious religious work, but the margins would be filled with drawings of grotesque monsters, knights fighting snails, or monkeys behaving badly. The art historian Lillian Randall, in her book Images in the Margins of Gothic Manuscripts, cataloged thousands of these bizarre images. What was their purpose? Were they just decoration? Were they a form of comic relief? Or were they a subversive commentary on the main text, a kind of carnivalesque world that turned the official order of things upside down? No one is entirely sure. This way of reading and writing has been called scholastic by thinkers like Marshall McLuhan. It assumed that a single text was not self-sufficient. It could only be understood in relation to all the other great texts, especially the Bible and the Church Fathers and the tradition of commentary that surrounded it. A page of a medieval manuscript visually represents this idea. It's a network of information. The main text is the central node, but the glosses and comments in the margins are just as important for a full understanding. We have lost this sense of the page as a conversational space. Our modern printed books, with their clean, uniform pages, present the text as a finished, authoritative monologue from the author. Is the internet with its hyperlinks, comment sections, and memes, actually a return to a more medieval way of reading, where every text is in conversation with every other text. What if we started publishing novels with a comment section printed in the margins? Did the invention of the printing press, which standardized the page and removed the scribe, make us dumber, less critical readers by presenting us with a text that looks too perfect and finished to be questioned? Number 10. What if time didn't move in a straight line? Our lives are governed by the clock and the calendar. We think of time as a relentless, forward-moving arrow. The past is gone, the future is not yet here. This linear view of time is so deeply ingrained in us that it's hard to imagine anything else. But for many people in the Middle Ages, time was also cyclical. It was a wheel, not an arrow. And this shaped the way they told stories. The most powerful cycle was the liturgical year of the church. The year was not just January to December. It was a repeating pattern of seasons: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. The story of Christ's life, death, and resurrection was reenacted every single year. People didn't just remember it, they experienced it again and again. This created a sense that the most important events were not in the distant past, but were in some sense eternally present. The other great cycle was the cycle of nature, the turning of the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. This rhythm of planting, growing, harvesting, and lying fallow governed the lives of the vast majority of people who worked the land. It was a pattern of birth, death, and rebirth. This cyclical worldview found its way into storytelling. One of the greatest examples is the 14th century English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The story begins at King Arthur's court on New Year's Eve. The mysterious Green Knight appears and proposes a challenge. The poem is meticulously structured around the turning of the year. We follow Gawain as the seasons pass from one new year to the next. The poet gives a long, beautiful description of the changing landscape as winter turns to spring, then summer, then autumn, and back to winter. Gawain's personal, linear journey of his quest is set within this larger, repeating, cyclical frame of the natural year. The story's structure mirrors a central medieval idea. Human life is a short, linear path, but it takes place within God's eternal, cyclical creation. This idea was often visualized as the Rota Fortunae, or the Wheel of Fortune. This image, made popular by the 6th century philosopher Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy, was everywhere in the Middle Ages. It shows a wheel being turned by the blind goddess Fortuna. At the top of the wheel is a king in his glory. As the wheel turns, he is cast down, and another figure rises from the bottom. The message was clear: worldly success is fleeting. Those who are on top will soon be at the bottom, and vice versa. This wasn't seen as tragic, but simply as the way of the world. Stories that followed this pattern, like the tragedies in Chaucer's Monk's Tale, were not about a character's fatal flaw. They were demonstrations of the inevitable turning of fortune's wheel. A king falls not because of a mistake he made, but simply because it was his time to fall. This is a very different model of storytelling from the Aristotelian idea of tragedy that we have inherited. Have we lost something important by seeing time as only an arrow? Does the cyclical view of time offer a more comforting, sustainable way to think about life and death? Are our modern stories of the rise and fall of celebrities or businesses just a secular version of the Wheel of Fortune? If we truly believed our lives were part of a repeating cycle, how would that change the stories we tell about ourselves? Number 9. What if the narrator didn't know anything? The modern novelist often aims to be omniscient, to know everything about the world and the characters. The narrator can tell us what everyone is thinking and feeling. Or they use a close third-person perspective, where we are locked inside one character's head. A common medieval technique was to do the opposite, to use a narrator who is naive, confused, and unreliable. This is not the same as the modern, unreliable narrator who is deliberately trying to deceive us. The medieval naive narrator is not malicious, they are just limited. They are often presented as a simple, bookish person who doesn't have much experience of the world. They wander through the story, reporting what they see and hear, but often admitting that they don't understand its full meaning. This forces the reader or listener to do the work of interpretation. We've already seen this with the narrator of the dream vision, who needs a guide to explain things. But it was used in other genres too. Geoffrey Chaucer is the absolute master of this. In the Canterbury Tales, the narrator who describes all the other pilgrims in the general prologue seems to be a very simple, unjudgmental person. He reports what he sees without much comment. He tells us the prioress has impeccable table manners and a tender heart for her little dogs. He tells us the monk loves hunting and wears fine clothes. He tells us the friar is a great fundraiser. On the surface, he seems to be admiring them all, but Chaucer the author expects his sophisticated audience to read between the lines. They would know that a prioress should be concerned with piety, not etiquette. They would know that a monk should be living a life of poverty and prayer, not hunting. The naive narrator reports the facts, but the reader is expected to make the moral judgment. This creates a rich, ironic texture that a more direct, judgmental narrator could never achieve. This technique also shows up in the great French romance, the Romance of the Rose. The first part, written by Guillaume de Loris in the 13th century, is told by a young lover who wanders into the garden of love. He is naive and idealistic, and he describes his experience of falling in love in allegorical terms. The second part, written by Jean de Meun 40 years later, continues the story, but the narrator becomes much more cynical and long-winded. The contrast between the two narrators and their worldviews is a central part of the poem's meaning. Why use this technique? It created a sense of humility. The storyteller wasn't pretending to be a great authority. He was just a fellow traveler sharing what he had seen, and perhaps he was as confused as you are. It also engaged the audience in a more active way. The audience couldn't just passively receive the story, they had to think critically about what the narrator was telling them and decide what it really meant. It was a way of teaching through puzzles rather than lectures. Is the naive narrator a more honest representation of the human condition than the all-knowing narrator, since in real life, we rarely understand the full meaning of events as they happen? Why have we come to trust the voice of an expert narrator more than one who admits their own confusion? Are there any truly popular modern examples of this technique, or is it a lost art? Number 8. What if a prophecy was a plot device? In modern stories, we tend to be suspicious of prophecies. They can feel like a lazy way to create foreshadowing or make the plot move forward. But in the medieval world, prophecy, curses, and divine portents were not just literary devices. They were considered a real part of how the world worked. The future was not entirely unknown. It could be glimpsed, often in dark and mysterious ways, and a prophecy, once spoken, was a powerful force that could shape the entire narrative. The belief in the power of the spoken word was immense. A blessing or a curse was not just a set of words, it was an act that could have real-world consequences. This is rooted in biblical and classical traditions. Think of the oracle at Delphi in Greek mythology or the prophets of the Old Testament. This belief carried straight through the Middle Ages. A story that was set in motion by a prophecy or a curse had an immediate sense of gravity and inevitability. The Arthurian legends are full of this. The character of Merlin is not just a wizard, he is a prophet. He knows the future, though he often speaks of it in riddles. He foresees Arthur's betrayal by Lancelot and Guinevere, and the eventual fall of the kingdom. This hangs over the entire story. Even when the court at Camelot is at its brightest and most glorious, the audience knows it is doomed. This doesn't destroy the suspense, it creates a profound sense of tragedy. The characters are moving towards a fate that has already been written. The story is not about if the kingdom will fall, but how. The human drama is in watching the characters make choices, some noble and some flawed, that lead them down the prophesied path. Its curses were just as powerful. In the sprawling German epic, the Nibelungenlied, written around 1200, the dwarf Alberic places a curse on the magical hoard of treasure that the hero Siegfried wins. This curse follows the treasure throughout the story, bringing death and destruction to everyone who possesses it. The curse is like a radioactive element, poisoning the relationships between characters and driving the plot towards its bloody conclusion. This wasn't just for epic literature. Prophecies were a real political tool. For centuries, the so-called prophecies of Merlin, first written down by Geoffrey of Monmouth, were used by political players in Britain. So people would interpret Merlin's obscure animal-based imagery to support their preferred candidate for the throne or to predict the outcome of a battle. These prophecies took on a life of their own, becoming part of the political discourse of the time. For a storyteller to use a prophecy in their tale was to tap into a deep and widely held cultural belief. It made the story feel more real and more significant. Do we still have a belief in prophecy? But we just call it by other names, like economic forecasting or predictive algorithms. Why are we still so drawn to chosen one narratives, which are essentially stories driven by a prophecy about a single individual? If you genuinely believed a curse could be placed on you, how would that change the way you interact with other people? Number 7. What was the medieval equivalent of a cinematic universe? Today, we're very familiar with the idea of a cinematic universe or a shared world. We have the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Star Wars galaxy, where different stories and characters all exist in the same continuity. The medieval world had its own version of this, a framework known as the Three Matters. This concept was first articulated by a 12th century French poet named Jean Baudel. He wrote that there were only three great cycles of stories, or matters, worth telling: the matter of Rome, the matter of France, and the matter of Britain. Each of these was a vast shared universe of characters, places, and events that any storyteller could draw from. The matter of Rome was the world of classical antiquity. These were stories about Alexander the Great, the city of Troy, and the adventures of Aeneas. They were not historically accurate retellings. They were medieval romances that just happened to feature classical heroes. Alexander was portrayed as a perfect chivalrous knight. The Trojan War was reimagined as a series of feudal jousts and sieges. This was a way for medieval culture to connect with and appropriate the prestige of the classical past, remaking it in its own image. The matter of France centered on the figure of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor, and his 12 paladins, or chief knights. The most famous of these stories is the Chanson de Roland, which tells of the heroic last stand of Charlemagne's best knight, Roland, at the Battle of Roncesvalles. These stories, known as chansons de geste, were typically more martial and patriotic than the other matters. They were about loyalty to your king, faith in God, and the conflicts between Christians and Saracens. The matter of Britain was the most popular and influential of all. This was the world of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Unlike Charlemagne, who was a real historical figure, Arthur was a legendary character with shadowy origins. This gave storytellers a huge amount of freedom. Writers across Europe, from France to Germany to England, added their own characters like Lancelot, Tristan, and Percival, and their own themes like courtly love and the quest for the Holy Grail to the Arthurian universe. This created a sprawling, complex, and sometimes contradictory body of legends that captivated the medieval imagination. When a storyteller began a tale by saying it took place in the days of the good King Arthur, the audience immediately knew the world they were in. They knew the rules, the key players, and the general atmosphere. This framework was incredibly productive. It gave storytellers a foundation to build on. They didn't have to invent a world from scratch every time. They could take familiar characters and put them in new situations, or invent a new knight and have him interact with Sir Gawain at Camelot. It created a sense of a large, persistent world that existed beyond any single story, just as modern fans feel that the world of a franchise exists beyond the latest movie. Are the Three Matters proof that there are only a few basic story types in the world, and we just keep retelling them with different costumes? What would be the three matters of our time? The matter of superheroes, the matter of the mafia, and the matter of the high school drama. By creating these vast shared worlds, did medieval storytellers accidentally invent the first fan fiction, since everyone felt they had the right to add their own story to the legend? Number 6. What if the hero's journey was a series of pop quizzes? The modern hero's journey often involves a deep internal transformation. The hero has to overcome a psychological flaw. In many medieval romances, the journey was much more external. It was structured as a series of tests. The plot was not driven by character development, but by a sequence of challenges that the knight had to overcome. This is the test, or quest, as the primary engine of the plot. A knight would set out from court, either to prove his worth, to fulfill a vow, or to right a wrong. His journey would be episodic. He would ride through a forest, and he would encounter a series of discrete adventures. Each adventure was a test of a particular chivalric virtue. He might have to fight a wicked knight who was terrorizing a castle, a test of his prowess and his commitment to justice. He might have to resist the advances of a seductive lady in a castle where he is a guest, a test of his chastity and his loyalty. He might have to solve a riddle to cross a bridge, a test of his wisdom. The 12th century French poet Chrétien de Troyes was a master of this structure. In his romance Yvain, or The Knight with the Lion, the hero, Yvain, has to complete a series of adventures to win back the love of his wife, Claudine. He rescues a lion from a serpent, and the grateful lion becomes his companion. He saves a group of maidens from a giant. He defends a woman who has been unjustly accused. Each episode is a self-contained test that demonstrates his worthiness. The story is the sum of these tests. He doesn't necessarily have a deep psychological breakthrough. He simply proves, through his actions, that he is a good knight. The ultimate quest, of course, was the quest for the Holy Grail. In the Grail romances, which became incredibly popular in the 13th century, the Knights of the Round Table set out to find the mysterious vessel. This was not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one. The tests were not just about fighting ability, but about spiritual purity. Sir Lancelot, the greatest knight in the world, fails in the quest because of his adulterous love for Queen Guinevere. Well, he is not spiritually worthy. The quest is ultimately achieved by Sir Galahad, his son, who is a perfect, chaste, Christ-like figure. The series of tests on the quest serves to sift the knights, separating the worldly from the spiritual and revealing who is truly the best. This structure made for great oral storytelling. Each episode could be a satisfying story in itself. A storyteller could perform one or two tests from a longer romance in a single evening. It also had a clear moral and didactic purpose. The story was a demonstration of the chivalric code in action. The audience learned what a good knight was supposed to do by watching the hero pass his tests. It is the structure of a video game where a player moves from level to level, completing specific tasks, a modern reinvention of the episodic quest narrative. Have we become so focused on the internal, psychological journey of a hero that we've forgotten how to tell a good story about external actions? What if the pass-fail nature of the medieval test is actually a more honest way of looking at morality than our modern focus on intention and inner feelings? Number 5. Could a story be told by what it leaves out? We expect stories to give us information. We want to know what characters look like, what their motivations are, and how they feel. Modern writers often spend a lot of time on detailed description and internal monologue. Some medieval storytelling traditions did the exact opposite. They used a technique of radical understatement, or what we might call negative space storytelling. The power of the story came not from what was said, but from what was left unsaid. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, are the supreme examples of this. The prose is famously terse, lean, and objective. The narrator almost never tells you what a character is thinking or feeling. Instead, they just report actions and dialogue. A character who has just received a mortal wound might deliver a dry, witty one-liner before dying. Two characters who are about to have a violent confrontation might have a very polite, formal conversation first. In Njál's saga, one of the greatest of the sagas, a character named Skarphedinn is renowned for his biting sarcasm and his unsettling grin. The saga tells us he is a tall man and a good swordsman, a fine swimmer, and a very swift runner. He was hardy and daring, and a poet to boot, but he was for the most part an ill-tempered man. When his family's home is surrounded by enemies and set on fire, his father, Njál, says that he and his wife will lie down and commend their souls to God, as they are too old to fight. Skarphedinn's reaction is simply reported. Skarphedinn smiled a little and said, "Our father is not thinking of being unavenged." The smiled a little is all the insight we get. The narrator doesn't tell us about his grief, his rage, or his love for his father. The gap is left for the audience to fill, and the effect is incredibly powerful. The emotion is all the stronger for being unstated. This technique was not limited to the sagas. You can see it in some of the early medieval epics as well. In the Chanson de Roland, when Roland finally decides to blow his elephant his horn to call Charlemagne for help, he knows the effort will kill him. The poem says, Roland sets the elephant to his mouth. He puts his whole strength into it and sounds it. The mountains were high and the sound carried a long way. They heard it for 30 leagues. It doesn't say Roland was filled with desperate regret and heroic resolve. It just describes the action, and the stark description is enough. Why this style? It may have come from a cultural preference for stoicism and dignity. Expressing emotion openly might have been seen as a sign of weakness.
It also shows a great deal of respect for the audience. The storyteller trusts the listener to understand the emotional stakes without having to fill in.
It forces the audience to become an active participant, to imagine the inner lives of the characters based on their brief, powerful actions. It is a show. Don't tell philosophy taken to its absolute extreme. Has our culture of oversharing on social media made it impossible for us to appreciate this kind of understated storytelling? Is it possible that describing emotions in detail actually makes them less powerful, not more? Could you write a successful modern novel in the style of an Icelandic saga, or would readers just find it cold and empty? Number 4, what if God was a character in the story? In a modern realistic novel, if a character is in trouble, they have to solve the problem themselves. If a miracle suddenly happened and saved them, we would call it a deus ex machina, a God from the machine, and consider it bad writing. It would feel like a cheat. In medieval stories, it was not a cheat. It was a central and expected feature of the world. Explicit divine intervention was a common and powerful plot device. The medieval worldview was thoroughly supernatural. God and the devil, Angels and demons were not abstract concepts. They were active agents in the world, constantly intervening in human affairs. A story that didn't acknowledge this would have been seen as unrealistic, so when a hero was in an impossible situation, it was perfectly natural for a miracle to occur. This happens all the time in the lives of the saints. A saint is about to be burned at the stake, and a sudden rainstorm comes and extinguishes the flames. A saint is thrown into a dungeon, and an angel appears to unlock the doors. This was the whole point of the story, to show that God protects his faithful. It also happens in the epic poems. In the Chanson de Roland, after Roland's heroic death, Charlemagne's army is chasing the Saracens. But the sun is setting, and they are about to lose their chance for vengeance. Charlemagne prays to God, and God makes the sun stand still in the sky, just as he did for Joshua in the Old Testament, allowing the Franks to finish their battle. This is not presented as a strange or surprising event. It is presented as a natural consequence of Charlemagne's status as God's chosen emperor. This belief in divine intervention also shaped how stories were resolved. The outcome of a battle could be determined by a trial by combat. Two knights would fight, and it was believed that God would grant victory to the one who was in the right. This provided a built-in dramatic climax for many stories. The fight was not just a test of skill, it was a divine judgment. In Malory's Le Morte Arthur, when Queen Guinevere is accused of treason, Sir Lancelot fights as her champion to prove her innocence. His victory is taken as proof from God that she is not guilty, even though, ironically, she is. This worldview creates a different kind of suspense. The question is not, will the hero succeed on his own, but is the hero worthy of God's help? The tension is moral and spiritual, not just physical. The story becomes a demonstration of the cosmic order. Good is rewarded, evil is punished, and God is in control. For a medieval audience, this was not a simplistic fantasy. It was a deep and comforting truth about the nature of reality. Have we simply replaced divine intervention with other, equally unlikely plot devices like the timely arrival of a secret ally or the sudden discovery of a hidden clue? What would a modern story look like if it genuinely and unironically included a miracle as a key plot point? Would it have to be a faith-based film? Or could it work for a mainstream audience? Does our insistence that characters solve their own problems reflect a modern arrogance about human self-sufficiency? Number 3. Why would a story be intentionally confusing? We value clarity. We want a story to make sense. A plot that is tangled, a sentence that is hard to follow, a character whose motives are unclear. We see these as flaws. But what if a story was deliberately complex, not to be confusing, but to reflect a more complex truth? This is the idea behind the Gothic, or flamboyant, style of late medieval storytelling. This technique is the literary equivalent of a late Gothic cathedral, like the one at Rouen or Cologne. These cathedrals are incredibly ornate. The surfaces are covered with intricate carvings, statues, and tracery. The structure is complex, with soaring vaults and flying buttresses. It is not simple or clean. It is a dazzling, almost overwhelming display of complexity. The goal was to create a sense of awe, to give a glimpse of the infinite complexity and beauty of God's creation. Some late medieval literature aimed for a similar effect. Instead of the lean, direct prose of the sagas, these writers used long, elaborate sentences with many subordinate clauses. They filled their stories with digressions, learned allusions, and ornate descriptions. The plot might be less important than the texture of the language. This style is often called aureate, from the Latin word for gold, because it was self-consciously golden and rhetorical. The Scottish poets of the 15th century, like William Dunbar, were famous for this, as was the English poet John Lydgate. Another version of this was the deliberately fragmented or unfinished narrative. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is famously unfinished. He never gets all the pilgrims to Canterbury, and not all of them even get to tell one tale, let alone the 4 each that were promised in the prologue. His House of Fame just stops mid-sentence. Was this because he died before he could finish them? Or was it a deliberate artistic choice? Some scholars, like Paul Strome, argue that Chaucer was intentionally playing with ideas of fragmentation and incompleteness. The world is a messy, unfinished place, and perhaps a story that reflects that is more truthful than one that is neatly tied up with a bow. This love of complexity also relates back to the interlace structure, but in the late Middle Ages, it could become even more pronounced. The result is a story that can feel like a labyrinth. You are constantly getting lost in side plots and digressions. The main thread is hard to follow. To a modern reader trained on Hemingway, this can be frustrating. But for the original audience, the pleasure may have been in the journey, not the destination. The joy was in getting lost in the dense, rich forest of the story. It was a challenge, a puzzle, and a display of the author's intellectual and rhetorical virtuosity. It was a way of saying that some truths are not simple and they cannot be expressed in simple language. Is the modern taste for minimalism just a passing fashion? Are we poor for having lost the patience for complex, ornate sentences and labyrinthine plots? Do experimental, difficult, modern writers like James Joyce or Thomas Pynchon represent a return to this medieval love of complexity? Or is the comparison flawed? Is there a beauty and incompleteness that our culture, obsessed with closure and clear answers, can no longer appreciate? Number 2, what happens when the audience can't read? This is the most fundamental difference between medieval storytelling and our own, and it underlies almost all the other techniques. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were illiterate. For them, stories were not encountered in private, on a page. They were experienced publicly, as a performance. The story was a sound, not a set of symbols. This fact of orality changed everything about how stories were constructed and received. A storyteller couldn't rely on the audience being able to go back and reread a confusing passage. The story had to be clear and memorable on first hearing. This is why you see so much repetition. Characters have stock epithets. The wise Nestor, the swift-footed Achilles in the Homeric tradition, which influenced medieval epic. Key phrases and themes are repeated. The structure is often episodic, so the listener can easily grasp each part of the story as a self-contained unit. The sound of the words was as important as their meaning. Much of medieval literature was poetry meant to be chanted or sung, often with musical accompaniment. The rhythm, the rhyme, the alliteration, these were not just decorative features. They were mnemonic aids, helping both the performer to remember the story and the audience to absorb it. They also made the experience more emotionally powerful and entertaining. The physical presence of the performer was key. They could use gestures, change their voice for different characters, and interact with the audience. It was a theatrical event. Because of this, authorship was a more fluid concept. A storyteller was not just reciting a fixed text. They were recreating the story in each performance, adding their own flourishes, perhaps tailoring the story to the specific audience. Her stories were not the fixed property of a single author. They were the shared property of the culture. A storyteller was a guardian and a transmitter of the shared tradition. This idea was explored in depth by Walter Ong in his influential 1982 book, Orality and Literacy. Ong argued that the shift from an oral to a literate culture was one of the most profound changes in human consciousness. Even when books did exist, they were precious, handmade objects. A monastery might have only a few hundred books in its entire library. Reading was often done aloud, even when someone was alone. The words were still sounds. The idea of silent, rapid, private reading that we take for granted is a relatively modern invention, a product of the printing press. For the medieval world, the story was a social glue, an event that brought the community together in a shared imaginative space. It has the internet, with its podcasts, audiobooks, and video streaming, created a new kind of secondary orality that shares some features with medieval culture. If you have only ever consumed stories through your ears, does your brain actually process narrative differently? What have we lost by turning storytelling from a communal, public event into a silent, private activity? Is a movie a closer experience to medieval storytelling than a novel is? Number 1. What if the ending was just a new beginning? Our stories are obsessed with endings, and they lived happily ever after. The case is solved, the couple gets together, the world is saved, we crave closure. Many medieval stories, especially the long romances, resist this. They often have what is called an open or continuing structure. The story doesn't so much end as it just stops, often with the promise of more adventures to come. This is partly a result of the episodic, quest-based nature of the narratives. Since the story is just a series of tests, you can always add one more. A knight returns to court victorious from one quest, and a messenger immediately arrives to announce a new problem that needs solving. The end of one adventure is simply the setup for the next. This created the medieval equivalent of a franchise sequel. If a story was popular, the storyteller or a different writer could easily pick up the thread and write a continuation. The great romance cycles, like the Arthurian legends or the stories of Charlemagne, grew over centuries in this way, with new authors constantly adding new episodes and characters. You can see this in Sir Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur. Even though the book ends with the tragic death of Arthur and the collapse of the Round Table, there's still a sense of openness. Mallory ends by discussing the popular belief that Arthur is not truly dead, but will one day return when his country needs him most rex quandam, rexque futuris, the once and future king. The ending is not a final closure, but a state of suspended animation, a promise of a future return. The story is not over forever. This open-endedness also reflects a different philosophical and religious outlook. In the Christian worldview that dominated the Middle Ages, the story of this world is not the final story. Earthly life is a journey, a pilgrimage, but the final destination is the next world. So, a story that ends with a neat and tidy happily ever after in this world might have seemed dishonest. The real ending, the final judgment, and the life to come was outside the scope of the story. The narrative of human life on Earth was, by its very nature, an unfinished one. This is a stark contrast to the classical Aristotelian model of a story, which demands a clear beginning, middle, and end, with a resolution that ties everything up. The medieval romance often feels more like a modern soap opera or a long-running comic book series where the story is always in the middle. The status quo is re-established at the end of each arc, only to be disrupted again in the next one. The goal is not to reach a final conclusion, but to keep the story going. Is our modern desire for neat endings a sign of anxiety, a need to impose order on a chaotic world? What if happily ever after is the most unrealistic and damaging lie that stories tell us? Could the medieval model of the continuing story, with its lack of final closure, actually be a more psychologically healthy and realistic way to think about our own lives, which never have neat endings, only transitions?